So I want to start with our first principle here, which is our inclusive mindset. So welcome to this particular session on an inclusive mindset. And so our agenda for this particular session is to talk about what an inclusive mindset is, what is diversity and inclusion, what motivates people uh, to be right or to be effective, like which should we be aiming towards, and then what gets in the way of being having an inclusive mindset, and lastly, how do we use our head, our heart, and our hands to become effective, inclusive leaders? So first of all, let me just define an inclusive mindset. An inclusive mindset is a collaborative thinking in managing ideas, people, and relationships. So it's a collaborative uh, mindset, right? It's a collaborative thinking. It's about being open to ideas, knowledge, perspectives, approaches, and styles, and listening to the differences from everyone, regardless of their or including because of their race, gender, or job roles, right? So this inclusive mindset is a mindset that is looking to capture and maximize as much information as they can to leverage to either help make a decision or to provide innovative thinking, right? So inclusive leaders. So when we think about diversity, we touched on this in a previous session, but I really want us to think about commonalities and differences, right? So as much as these shapes are similar, they are also very different. And so sometimes in a class setting, I'll have people write down the differences between these shapes or the commonalities of these shapes. But both of these are important to recognize simultaneously. And so an inclusive mindset recognizes that I cannot be colorblind, right? That colorblind doesn't lead me to to a set of goals, or it gives me the ability to reach a set of goals if I'm approaching life that way. Now, what we have to recognize is that that was a great intention on the part of people, but it certainly misses the mark, because if you don't recognize the fact that I'm African American, and that's not the only identity I have a number of intersections of identity. But if you miss that part, then you miss how the rest of the world may see me, or you may miss how I've been able to acquire information. Right. So it's important to recognize differences, and recognizing differences isn't the problem. It's the values that we associate with differences that oftentimes can become problematic. Right. So it is important to recognize our commonalities and our difference. Yes, we've all been hungry. We've all yearned for something. We've all, been in love. We've all had our heart broken. Right. And some of us have been the heartbreakers, but that's a whole nother thing. So we have those things in common. However, who we've been in love with, how those things happen, what we've yearned for or what we've hungered for may in fact be very different. So there's this universality of our human experience, and then there's the uniqueness of our human experience. And both must be addressed as we think about being an inclusive leader. So diversity really is this looking at these uniquenesses, and inclusion is like, how do I take those uniquenesses and those commonalities and maximize them for the greatest effect, right? We'll talk a little bit about equity in just a second, but this idea that you've received an invitation to the dance, that's diversity. So we have a diverse group of people there, but inclusion is being invited to the dance. And I would say, if we take a step further, that equity is being asked, what kind of music do you like to dance to? But we'll talk more about equity in just a moment. So, what is it that human beings are after? And I would suggest that Abraham Maslow was right. And depending on what model you use, you'll get 5 or 7 pieces of a hierarchy of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy. But I like Alfred Adler's three motivations of humans: that we're looking for significance, we're looking for belonging, and we're looking for safety. Right? Significance says that I'm a person with purpose and power. I was born with something in mind, right? So like my birth wasn't an accident. And whether I decide what that purpose is, or or the heavens open up and reveal what my purpose is, we all have purpose and we all have power. Right. So we all have significance. So people are looking for significance. They're also looking for belonging. And belonging is this idea, this concept that I have a group of people around me who recognize my significance, who recognize my purpose, who recognize my power. Some of those groups are people we've been born into, and others are groups that we select. Right. So this idea of belonging really is about surrounding myself with people who understand my purpose and my power. And then lastly, we want to be physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually safe to be in relationships with people who understand our significance, right? So we want to be safe to be in relationships where we belong, so that we can recognize or have our significance recognized. Right. And so an example that I use, and it's a pretty crude example, but I want you to think about it. And so when I talk about this, I ask the question, why is it that kids join gangs? Why is it that young people join gangs? And typically it's for one of these reasons, or a combination, or all three of these reasons, that they're looking for significance, belonging, and safety. And so then I also ask, why do kids join the Boys and Girls Club or 4-H? Why do they do those things? And I think it's pretty easy to come up with the fact that it's the same things, right? They're looking for significance, they're looking for belonging, and they're looking for safety. And so when we think about those motivations, the motivations are the same, but how they get actualized is very different. And I oftentimes joke, what would happen if 4-H adopted a gang? Right. So I always think that that's an interesting perspective to have. So we'll continue. So I touched on this a little bit before. So we're talking about an inclusive mindset, right? And so we know that 51% is winning. If I have 51% of the votes, or just, people, in a democratic process, that's all I need is 51%. But inclusive mindsets recognize that 49% can be very problematic or challenging or difficult if we don't address their needs. And so when we talk about having an inclusive mindset, that's really what we're talking about. Someone who can not only look at the so-called majority, but recognize that statistical minority may in fact may be able to help us in reaching our goals. So where I come from, these nuts have a number of names, right? So growing up in my family, we refer to them as Brazil nuts. However, there are other family systems where they were given other names, like the N-word toes. So the N-word, right? So the N-word, right? So why am I bringing this up? Because inclusive leaders have to recognize that people come from a context, and they name things, they call things, they act the way they do because they come from a particular context. So many of the people who called these nuts by another name other than Brazil nuts, they were coming from a particular context. And how we engage with them becomes important. So we must recognize the context that they come from. So we have to use our heads to think about that. We have to use our hearts and have some empathy and compassion for them. But lastly, we have to use our hands and hold them accountable to the new context that we're moving into. And we'll talk more about context in a following session. So what oftentimes gets in the way? So oftentimes, I don't know if people have seen this this diagram, but there's typically this diagram with the picture of the people looking over the fence, and there are different kinds of boxes. But it became very clear to me that the problem isn't the people and the problem isn't the resources, but it's the artificial barriers that we put up that block opportunities for people. And if we remove those barriers when appropriate, then we actually create more access for folks. And so the problem isn't the people and it's not the resources, it's the barrier. And so one of the things that inclusive mindsets requires us to do is question our policies, our procedures, our barriers that prevent people from participating. And are those barriers necessary? And secondly, are they helping us to reach our goals? I am not an anarchist. Chaos is not my friend. And so I do recognize that there are needs and places for fences. But what that fence looks like and where that fence needs to be in accordance to our goal orientation. So what are we trying to do? And do the systems around us give us access to that, give equal access to those things, which actually creates equity? And so what are the skills needed for the development of a inclusive mindset? So we need to look at our head, we need to look at our hearts, and we need to look at our hands as tools for goal direction. So oftentimes people will ask, well, Andre, do I just tolerate anything? So are you suggesting, Andre, that I have to take everything that people offer or any kind of attitudes that people have or behaviors? And I like to suggest, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I am suggesting, though, that is inclusive leaders, it is our job to look at those things and direct those towards goals. So if we have goals or behaviors that are not leading us to our goal, then those behaviors are the ones that we may want to encourage people to augment, right? So head is simply refers to believing that everyone is unique and that everyone has value and should be treated as a valued partner. Right. Our heart is that a leader who holds this has a vested interest in making sure that people can bring their best selves to work. Right, that their best selves to work to help us achieve our goal. And then lastly, an inclusive leader has to be one who's willing to pay attention and do the work necessary to make sure that folks are included. Because if left to our own devices without cognition, we would gravitate back to our own, sections of the lunch table, if you will. If you go back to a K-12 setting, right, we'll go back to the places where we feel most comfortable, which won't necessarily produce the results that we're looking for. And so as leaders, we take responsibility for that. And then lastly, leaders with an inclusive mindset, they see things from other people's perspectives. So they look for a number of opportunities and perspectives to gain information or to see how a decision may impact folks. And then they understand that criticisms or complaints may really be around this idea of having different perspectives. And so if they can help people see different perspectives, that those complaints may come down, and so might those the animosity or negative energy that comes from conflict. And then they also avoid taking things personally. They don't see these things as personal attacks. They recognize that they're a part of a process of development. And then lastly, they recognize that all human behavior is goal directed. And so they recognize that we're all looking and trying to reach for that safety, significance, and belonging, that those are the goals of our behavior. And so inclusive leaders take those and move forward in driving not only that 51%, but taking that 49% with them. And with that ends this particular section on inclusive mindset. I'll see you in the next session.